an honor to be asked to speak to a group of people doing as much strategic and principled good as this organization, not to mention the good that those of you who are doctors and health advocates do in your day jobs. The closest that I ever came to a respectable profession was when I studied architecture prior to dropping out. I later got a master's degree in philosophy, which together with a couple of dollars will get you a bus ride. Architecture students always read this novel by Ayn Rand called The Fountainhead because the protagonist is an architect. But architecture doesn't come into it very much. The book focuses more on the fact that the guy is also rather a sociopath. But around the time that I read that book, I also read a book called The Plague by Albert Camus, in which the protagonist dedicated himself to cheerfully making the world a better place against overwhelming odds, without any real concern for the likelihood of success, and without any particular mythologizing of the good supposedly accomplished by being a superior bastard. Camus' protagonist has stuck with me, though I haven't reread the book. He is always somewhere in the back of my head, and of course he was a doctor. I've rather given up on every other profession in our society. NYU has just hired Harold Coe, legal architect of drone wars, legal defender of the 2011 war on Libya, and of presidential war powers, to teach human rights law. After law students, circulated a petition last week denouncing Coe and the hiring of Coe, liberal law professors around the country created a counter-petition defending the hiring of Harold Coe. Our hope right now, I think, does not lie with lawyers. I know there are exceptions, thank goodness. Teaching in U.S. academia now are John Yoo, David Petraeus, all variety of killers and torturers. Eric Prince, the creator of the mercenary company Blackwater, came on a book tour to the University of Virginia this week and was treated like any good academic. After all, the people his company is killing are not usually Americans or Christians or English speakers. A couple of years ago, professors at the University of Virginia organized a teach-in favor of a U.S. war on Syria. The students have not organized an event for, against, or indifferent to any war. But I do not turn to academia for inspiration at the moment. I know there are rare exceptions. Do I even have to mention the shortcomings of the hacks we used to call statesmen and women? The Congressional Progressive Caucus produced its progressive budget this month. It stood no chance of passing. It was a rhetorical statement. Yet it made no mention of an item that takes up the majority of the budget, namely militarism. If you hunted through the numbers, you could find that they were proposing to cut militarism, which has doubled during the so-called war on terror. They were proposing to cut it by 1%. I don't look to politicians for salvation. I would say, in this case as well, that I know there are rare exceptions, except that I don't. Not in the federal government. There are, at best, people who try to mitigate the damage a bit, or who plagiarize the parental, or maybe it's medical, attitude of, this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you, as they sorrowfully destroy the planet. So I don't really need to put the entire weight of humanity on you, but maybe physicians, or at least some significant number of physicians, are a group we can look to with respect and appreciation rather than contempt and sadness. When I was in philosophy school at the University of Virginia, near the home of the guy who wrote that we were endowed by a creator with certain inalienable rights, I came across the idea of how ludicrous that might sound to a doctor. You have to picture the scene of a doctor cutting open a human body and trying to locate the right to free speech, for example. Do people really believe political rights are somehow inherent in us anymore? I don't know. As opposed to being things that we create and struggle to defend. I don't know. But I will tell you what a lot of people do believe. They believe that war is inherent in the human body. Now, let me ask those of you who are doctors and health professionals, let me ask you, as doctors, have you ever looked into a human brain or any other organ and discovered there A massive cultural institution that requires huge organization, planning, preparations, and investment, and has been completely unknown to most humans who have ever lived. Of course you haven't. If there's anything meant by calling a behavior natural, war is the furthest thing from it. Raise your hand if you have encountered any epidemics of PTSD, post-traumatic stress from war deprivation. The United States would have to cut its military by 95% of military spending to match the average of the other 95% of humanity, if the spending is taken per capita. 99.5% if taken per nation. So if you could find war in a human body, would you find it prominent in US bodies and in US infants? Of course not. That seems pretty easy to figure out even without medical school, but I'm not sure most Americans would go along with it. War, they believe, is built into us somehow. Okay, here's an even easier question. War has been evolving technologically and in other ways. Who can tell me the #1 way in which war kills people today? Just shout it out. Diseases, poverty, starvation, poverty, infrastructure. I think you are basically onto the answer, which is rather unique because most people are not, although some people at various events have said diseases. War used to kill more people than it injured, and it used to kill them first and foremost by spreading deadly diseases. Deadly diseases remain the top cause of death in poor countries on earth, but the way that war contributes to them is primarily through the diversion of resources into war. While tens of billions of dollars per year could provide the earth with clean drinking water and all sorts of hygienic and medical aid, not to mention ending starvation, $2 trillion every year, half of it from the United States alone, is dumped into war. If military spending were redirected into a global, not exactly a Marshall Plan, but a global relief plan and a domestic relief plan and a massive crash investment in green energy aimed at protecting the planet's climate, imagine the lives that could be saved. As already noted, this very idea is basically absent from discussions of the US government's budget. Of course, war advances disease and starvation through its active destruction, its generation of refugee crises, and the injuries and trauma it inflicts. So drawing a line between deaths caused by war and those caused by other sicknesses seems difficult. Wars have rendered large areas of the earth uninhabitable, generated tens of millions of refugees. War has slowed the eradication of polio, may have spread HIV and AIDS, landmines make farmland unusable, etc. War, quote, rivals infectious disease as a global cause of morbidity and mortality, end quote, according to Jennifer Leaning of Harvard Medical School. Leaning divides war's environmental impact into 4 areas. Quote, production and testing of nuclear weapons, aerial and naval bombardment of terrain, dispersal and persistence of landmines and buried ordnance, and use or storage of military defoliants, toxins, and waste. According to the World Health Organization, quote, between 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths per year from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress, end quote. That prediction could be wildly off in either direction, possibly depending on what we do in the next 15 years. War is not only our top producer of Superfund sites and destroyer of islands used as bombing ranges, but it is our top consumer of petroleum. The US military burns more oil and gas than does each of a majority of the nations on Earth. The military obsession with oil began as a way to fuel the British Navy. The British Navy wasn't created to fight over the oil. The idea that keeping the wars far away, where they only kill people who don't look like us, the idea that that will keep us safe. Well, that idea falls apart if you even glance at it from all different directions, but one story that can stick with people and make the point, I think, is the story of John Wayne's death. Raise your hand if you know how John Wayne died. Cancer. Who do you get the cancer from? No. Sorry? He died filming pro-war movies in order to avoid going to war himself. He filmed a movie downwind from nuclear test site, and a huge percentage, 3 times the normal percentage of the cast and crew on that movie died of cancer, including him. You can run, but you cannot hide. The Koch brothers beach houses will go underwater. There is only one little planet, and there is no planet B, as they say. Here's another question. Does the United States spend more money fighting wars or preparing to fight wars? Preparing. You guys are a smart crowd. We hear huge outcries over war spending. We read all the calculations of comparisons of war spending and what we could have purchased instead. But war preparation spending, the normalized, routine, so-called base military spending, is 10 times greater. It would stun President Eisenhower in its size, in its profitability, in its privatized nature, and in the degree to which chunks of it are recycled back into the system through bribery that we call campaign contributions. Just as the people involved spin through a revolving door between public and private sector employment. Opposing a war in order to save money and keep the military prepared for supposedly better wars is a self-defeating argument. It is the preparation for wars that spends most of the money and that generates the wars. So, militarism, by the greatest purveyor of violence on earth, kills first by sucking up all the money, and most of it is for maintaining the military. Actually using that military becomes an excuse for extra money. But there is another major problem with militarism before even arriving at actual wars, and that is weapons sales. The United States is far and away the leading seller and donor of military weaponry to the rest of the world. A good patriotic weapons factory job is in fact a job producing weapons for dictatorships and so-called democracies around the globe. We are trained to think of Western Asia, the Middle East, as inherently violent. But the vast majority of the weapons are from the United States. The US-backed dictatorship in Saudi Arabia uses US weapons to support the US-backed dictatorships in Bahrain and Yemen, and is currently bombing US weapons in Yemen using other US weapons which the US is rushing to replenish. Imagine a prison experiment like the famous one at Stanford where you give some students power over others and wait for the cruelty to begin. Only imagine that whenever you use Muslim students, you provide each guard and prisoner with tasers and grenades and automatic assault rifles. If you then conclude that Muslims are more violent, that would be ridiculous. But if you watch a political talk show tomorrow morning, that is what they will tell you. So coming finally to war itself, an article in the June 2014 issue of the American Journal of Public Health said, quote, since the end of World War II, there have been 248 armed conflicts in 153 locations. The U.S. launched 201 overseas military operations between the end of World War II and 2001, since which others, including Afghanistan and Iraq. During the 20th century, 190 million deaths could be directly and indirectly related to war, more than in the previous 4 centuries. Despite population growth, this sounds like it might be at odds with the Western academic pretense that war is going away. In fact, that pretense is based largely on the fact that some other forms of violence have declined, combined with a Western view of war that miscounts the dead, attributes many of the dead to other causes, and weighs the dead in places wars occur against the population of the globe or of the distant war power that attacked a poorer country. The same article goes on to say that, quote, civilian war deaths constitute 85% to 90% of casualties caused by war, end quote, including delayed casualties. For example, quote, 70 to 90% of the victims of the 110 million landmines planted since 1960 in 70 countries were civilians, end quote. Of course, these numbers also indicate something else about war victims. Most of them are on one side. When the U.S. attacks Iraq or Afghanistan or Pakistan and most of the deaths are civilian, those include few, if any, U.S. civilians. The civilians killed are all in the place where the war is. And to them can be added most of the non-civilians, as also being residents of the country under attack. When we hear about U.S. war dead and the suffering of U.S. military families, the suffering can be absolutely heartbreaking. But it is barely a drop in the bucket of all the damage done. And when U.S. newspapers tell us that the deadliest U.S. war was, what do they tell us was the deadliest U.S. war ever?
Civil War.
The U.S. Civil War, which killed perhaps 750,000 people, compared to 1.5 million out of a population of 6 or 7 million in the Philippines. Perhaps 2 million in Korea, 4 million in Vietnam, and something over 1 million in Iraq. When the U.S. media says that the U.S. Civil War was the deadliest U.S. war without specifying that it is only talking about U.S. lives, it keeps the U.S. public extremely misinformed about its largest public investment. Some of the worst wars in recent years have been in places like the Congo and Sudan that we hear less about, but that our government plays a part in. The United States backed an invasion of Rwanda in 1990 by a Ugandan army led by U.S.-trained killers and supported their attack on Rwanda for 3.5 years. People fled the invaders. Huge refugee crises, ruined agriculture, wrecked economy, and shattered society. The U.S. and the West armed the war makers and applied pressure with the World Bank and the IMF and USAID, and among the results was increased hostility between the Tutsis and the Hutus. Eventually the government would topple. First would come the mass slaughter known as the Rwandan genocide, and before that would come the murder of 2 presidents. At that point, in April of '94, Rwanda was in chaos almost on the level of post-liberation Iraq or Libya. The assassination of the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi was likely done by the U.S.-backed and U.S.-trained war maker Paul Kagame, now president of Rwanda. The West did not send in peace workers or negotiators, but allowed the crisis to develop. The killing of civilians in Rwanda has continued ever since, although the killing has been much more heavy in neighboring Congo, where Kagame's government took the war with U.S. aid and weapons and troops, and bombed refugee camps, killing some 1 million people. The excuse for going into Congo has been the hunt for Rwandan criminals. The real motivation, one of them, has been Western control and profits and resources, including materials used in the NSA tracking devices that we call our telephones. War in the Congo has continued to this day, leaving as many as 6 million human beings dead. But the worst major war led by U.S. troops in recent years has, of course, been Iraq, a sociocide, a killing of a society. I've seen polling suggesting that Americans believe that their nation suffered, but Iraq benefited from that war, with a plurality in the U.S. believing that Iraqis are grateful. It is on these sorts of lies that arguments for future humanitarian wars rest. In March, last month, Physicians for Social Responsibility co-authored a report called Body Count that looks at deaths in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan over a 12-year period, finding 1.3 million people killed by U.S.-led war-making, of whom 1 million were Iraqi. Some have placed the figures much higher, especially in the case of Afghanistan. Others have looked at Iraq going back to 1991 and found a total of 3 million Iraqis killed by U.S.-led wars and sanctions over that longer period. The deaths in recent U.S. wars in Yemen, Somalia, Libya, and elsewhere add to the total, as do the death and suffering of refugees abroad following wars of so-called liberation. One estimate finds 4 million people in Muslim countries killed by U.S.-led wars since 1990. So how does the war on Iraq compare with historical horrors? Because we're told things are getting better, right? The worst single, relatively short event in world history, the worst thing we've done to ourselves as a species, was World War II. One can ignore the decades of decisions that led up to it, the Treaty of Versailles, the Wall Street funding of Nazis, the rejection of Jewish refugees, the antagonization of Japan. One can ignore the vicious brutality of its conduct, including the absolutely unjustifiable development and use of nuclear weapons. One can claim it was a good war, but one can hardly dispute the vast extent of the death and misery. The impact of World War II on particular nations varied dramatically, from 16% of the population of Poland killed all the way down to 0.01% in Iraq. That compares to 5% of Iraq's population killed by Operation Iraqi Liberation, the original name with the acronym OIL of the 2003 war. That's 1.4 million out of 27 million, or 11% of the Iraqi population killed since 1991. That's 3 million out of 27 million. In World War II, Poland, Lithuania, and the Soviet Union suffered a higher percentage of deaths than Iraq has from its recent US-led wars. Most nations did not. Japan lost 3 to 4%, France and Italy 1%, the United Kingdom less than 1%, the United States 0.3%. 9 nations in World War II lost 1 million or more lives. 5 or 6 lost over 3 million. Of course, the Soviet Union and China lost lots more than that. But among those that did not lose 1 million were France, Italy, the United Kingdom, and the United States. So the United States imposed a level of killing on Iraq that it has not experienced, not even in the US Civil War, in which it may have lost 2% of its population. And the damage continues to spread. A group like ISIS has a long ways to go to reach total US murder counts, or even total Saudi beheadings. But ISIS would not exist without the US attack of 2003. A comprehensive calculation of US killing in Iraq might include some share of ISIS's killing. Of course, in saying that, I am aware of the necessity to add the obvious disclaimer that, contrary to popular conception, blame is not a finite quantity. When you blame someone for something, you don't unblame anybody else. ISIS remains 100% guilty of its killings, even though it would not have come into existence without the US war machine that is now trying to fix the problem with yet more war. The second strangest thing about war is that, unlike other evils that hardly compare to it in evilness, we are not by and large trying to get rid of it. Instead, rules are constantly being devised to distinguish good wars from bad, small wars known as terrorism. The strangest thing about war is that the efforts to devise the good wars are making it much easier to start more wars. Drones are still only killing half as many people as US police officers kill, but they are serving to stir up much greater violence. A report by the United Nations Special Rapporteur, also known as Tony Blair's wife's law partner, remember what I said about lawyers with apologies to the good ones, maintains that drones have now made war the norm. This is an institution, the United Nations, supposedly established to abolish war, albeit using war to abolish war, that is now declaring war the normal state of affairs. How is such a development directly related to our biggest public program, not news? A law professor named Rosa Brooks, whose mother I consider something of a genius and a hero, who speaks at War Resisters League and other peace events, has herself now advocated for legally establishing permanent wartime, doing away with any distinction between peace and war in order to apply the same laws everywhere, all the time. Now, in her defense, there was something unsustainable about this US liberal, lawyerly notion that murdering someone with a drone is either murder, if not part of a war, or just fine if part of a war, with the determination as to whether or not it's part of a war being left up to the people firing the missile. And the answer as to what makes the war legal being left unanswered. But the solution is not to throw in the towel on civilization and declare war eternal and limitless. The solution is to ban weaponized drones, which even by the standards of the civilizers of war should be no more acceptable, because no more targeted and discriminate in their actual use than poison gas. Of the thousands of men and women and children murdered by drones, and murder is the charge brought against the CIA station chief by the courts in Pakistan, murder is the term that the US government itself uses in its drone justification memos. Of the thousands killed, most have been so-called collateral damage. and most of the rest have been profiled, with living while Muslim serving as the equivalent of driving while black. Many of those actually targeted could easily have been arrested if charged with any crime. And the vast majority of the drone victims are not the dead, and are not the wounded, but are the traumatized, the children who dare not go out of doors, and who spend days and weeks wondering at what instant everything will be pulverized. Banning fully automated drones, but keeping other armed drones legal, and selling them to dozens of nations, grossly overestimates the distinction between a drone pilot and a machine. By the accounts of a former drone pilot, there is virtually no thought involved in following the illegal orders that constitute the job of piloting drones. Unless we end drone wars, the next president will walk into the power of murder at whim, as well as greater war powers, greater secrecy powers, greater spying powers than ever before held by anyone on earth. The idea that it matters which individual walks into those powers, choosing between two warmongers, is ridiculous. But let me come back to that point. The damage of all types of war has to include the injuries and the trauma as well as the deaths. It also has to include war's status as top cause of homelessness. 43 million people have been driven out of their homes and remain in a precarious state as internally displaced, 24 million, refugees, 12 million, and those struggling to return. The UN's figures for the end of 2013 list Syria as the origin of 9 million such exiles. Colombia comes in second place after years and years of war. Congo third, Afghanistan fourth. Also in the top of the list, Iraq, Somalia, Pakistan, Yemen, and Palestine. Humanitarian war has a homelessness problem. Honduran children are not bringing Ebola-infected Korans. They are fleeing a US-backed coup and Fort Benning-trained torturers. The case that we're trying to make at World Beyond War, which is a new organization I'm working with, is for the ending of all war, because war does not have an upside. It makes us less safe, it robs us of resources, it kills, injures, harms like nothing else, drains an economy, erodes civil liberties, perverts morality, damages the natural environment, increasingly risks nuclear holocausts, increasingly because of the proliferation of nuclear weaponry and energy, and because of the lack of interest in preventing disaster. The Soviet and US occupations of Afghanistan have destroyed or damaged thousands of villages and sources of water. The Taliban has illegally traded timber to Pakistan, resulting in huge deforestation. US bombs and refugees in need of firewood have added to the damage. Afghanistan's forests are almost gone. Most of the migratory birds no longer pass through there. The air and water have been poisoned with explosives and rocket propellants. The movements resisting US base construction and presence in South Korea, Okinawa, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Sicily, Sardinia, Italy, England, the Marianas, and even in the United States are focused on preventing environmental damage as well as on preventing war. Despite the huge catalog of health impacts from war and militarism, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the National Institutes of Health provide 0 grants for work on war prevention. And war prevention is not taught in most schools of public health. The NRA is trying to keep doctors from advising kids on the dangers of guns. What about the dangers of enlistment? I have never seen a good argument that we can survive continuing to make war like this. And yet, there is just a universal assumption that we will continue it. Just as there was the assumption that plantation slavery would continue, right up until just before it ended. On fossil fuel consumption, there's a growing assumption that we will end it, with most people assuming that we will end it at a pace that is probably too slow. And yet, somehow this seems to cheer people up. This week on TomDispatch.com, which is a wonderful source of news, Michael Clare wrote that a shift to renewable energy is underway, and that, quote, perhaps the most impressive indication of this shift can be found in the carbon reduction plans major nations are now submitting to the UN in preparation for a global climate summit in December in Paris. These plans have proven to be impressively tough and ambitious. The numbers being offered when it comes to carbon reduction would have been inconceivable a few years ago. The U.S. plan promises carbon emissions will drop 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025, which represents a substantial reduction. No one can predict the outcome of the climate summit, but few observers expect the measures it may endorse to be tough enough to keep future increases in global temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius. The maximum amount scientists believe the planet can absorb without incurring climate disasters far beyond anything seen to date. Nevertheless, implementation of the plans, or even a significant portion, would at least produce a significant reduction in fossil fuel consumption and point the way to a different future, end quote. Think about this a minute. The author is predicting a future of disasters far beyond anything we've known, and yet it is somehow encouraging because we will have slowed the pace at which we are worsening those disasters for the still more distant future. Even though this new, reduced U.S. consumption of petroleum in 2025 will be vastly greater than current European consumption of petroleum now. Or anywhere else on Earth, of course. This is something like how many Americans think of war. It's become the norm. It's become the main thing we do. We have an economy built around it. We've empowered the president and secret agencies to engage in it with no questions asked. Polls of the world find the United States overwhelmingly seen as the greatest threat to peace on Earth. And yet, Steven Pinker and some other imperialist professors say war is going away, so it must be. And that's nice, because we're all for peace, especially the Pentagon. Eric Prince said he was in favor of peace when he spoke at UVA this week. Today is a day of action everywhere against the terrible plutocratic plan, also known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, also known as the TPP, also known as NAFTA on steroids, and as the bestowing of nationhood on corporations. That they have packed everything bad on every issue into a single law and are trying to pass it in secret, even though we know from leaks much of what is in it, ought to be taken as an opportunity to launch a massive popular movement for change. Some of you guys have been working on it for a while. And for shifting our priorities from war profiteers and other oligarchs to human needs. That the next presidential election, already underway, is going to put up one incredibly corrupt corporate warmonger against another, both of them possibly from presidential dynasties, ought to be taken as an opportunity. What if we were to withhold a bit of the resources, the money, the time that we usually invest in an election and invest it in policy-based activism for peace, for the environment, and for election reform that would allow us to elect and unelect who we want? The results could be dramatic. I am not against elections. I think we should start having some. In 2016, we will not have a legitimate election with any chance of doing anyone any good in its choice of president. Here's what I think we need. No private election spending. Free media airtime on our airwaves for candidates qualified by signature gathering. Public financing, ballot access, and debate access by the same qualification. No gerrymandering. Hand-counted paper ballots, publicly counted at every polling place. An election day holiday. Limited campaign season. Automatic voter registration. Just did it in Oregon. Full representation for Washington, D.C. and every U.S. colony in the Caribbean and Pacific. Voting rights regardless of criminal conviction. National popular vote with no electoral college, well on the way to success. Mandatory voting with an option for none of the above. Abolition of the United States Senate. A larger House of Representatives. Direct public vote on important matters, the national initiative. Ban on war profiteering. A ban on secret budgets and agencies. And a ban on executive power used by vice presidents. And here's how I think we could get most of that. Declare the current system so broken that you will invest not a minute and not a dime in trying to elect anyone president of the United States. Instead, put all of that effort and all of that money into a policy-driven, nonviolent activist campaign for these reforms and other urgent policy changes, peace, the environment, etc., at the local, state, and federal levels. It is a well-kept secret that the primary propaganda goal of the government is not to sell us on wars or convince us they care about us, but to persuade us that we are powerless. Why did the governments invest such enormous resources in opposing the Occupy movement? Why is the Pentagon working with Facebook to study how emotions can be manipulated and movements stifled? Not because we are powerless. In 2013, the warmongers wanted to bomb Syria. But you had members of Congress reportedly expressing concern that they not become seen as the guy who voted for another Iraq. Why is Hillary Clinton not already president? Because unlike President Obama, she wasn't in the Senate in time, she was in the Senate in time to vote for and advocate for and propagandize for the 2003 Iraq invasion. Who made that a badge of shame rather than honor? In large part, the peace movement. Or I should say the anti-Republican war movement, which is not exactly the same as a peace movement. There are some startling signs that people are ready for actions that require sacrifice. There's a great media outlet here in Baltimore called therealnews.com that I was just doing an interview with outside, and one of their reporters pointed out to me that in the past week, a man has landed his little bicycle helicopter on the U.S. Capitol grounds in an attempt to deliver 535 demands to clean the money out of politics, knowing he'd lose his job and everything else. A man has apparently shot himself to death at the U.S. Capitol after holding up a sign that reportedly said, "Tax the 1%. Does that sound like people not ready to organize for action? We are held back primarily by our accepting and repeating of the propaganda that we have no power. And of course, we have a moral duty to try, even if there's only the slimmest chance that we have any power. And of course, doing so is enjoyable and fulfilling. Read The Plague by Albert Camus. This comes at the end of it. Quote, "It was in the midst of shouts rolling against the terrace wall in massive waves that waxed in volume and duration, while cataracts of fire fell thicker through the darkness, that Dr. Ryu resolved to compile this chronicle, so that he should not be one of those who hold their peace, but should bear witness in favor of those plague-stricken people, so that some memorial of the injustice and outrage done them might endure, and to state quite simply what we learn in time of pestilence, that there are more things to admire in men and women than to despise." Thank you.